Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Van Weergen, and I am the Director of Marketing here at the International Institute for Analytics. Welcome to today's webinar, the 2019 Predictions and Priorities with Bill Franks, Tom Davenport, and Bob Morison. In case you are new to the International Institute for Analytics, also known as IIA, we are a research and advisory firm co-founded by Tom Davenport and our CEO, Jack Phillips. We work with companies to grow their capabilities, improve performance, and get the most impact from analytics. This webinar is part of our ongoing webinar series that highlight important concepts, techniques, and strategies in the world of data and business analytics. Our clients rely on IIA to provide unbiased insights and a range of perspectives from our network of independent analytic experts and practitioners. For more information on IIA, visit us at iianalytics.com. Today's webinar is hosted by IIA research expert Bob Morison. Bob is an accomplished business researcher, writer, discussion leader, and management consultant. He has been leading breakthrough research at the intersection of business, technology, and human asset management for more than 20 years. Bob conducted the market research that he and all of IIA has relied on this year. Joining him is Bill Franks and Tom Davenport. Bill is IIA's Chief Analytics Officer, and his focus has always been to translate complex analytics into terms that business users can understand and work with, and helped organizations implement their analytics effectively. He has worked with many industries, from companies from Fortune 100 and to small nonprofits. Tom Davenport, who is one of IIA's co-founders, is also the president of Distinguished Professor of Information Technology Management at Babson College, the co-founder of IIA, and the fellow of the MIT Invitation on the Digital Economy. He teaches analytics and big data in executive programs at Babson, Harvard Business School, MIT Sloan School, and Boston University. Okay, Bob, I'm going to let you take it away from here.
All right, thank you so much, Lindsay. Hello, everyone. This is Bob. I've got the easy job today. I'll be steering the conversation a bit, keeping the time and monitoring questions as they come in via chat. Bill and Tom will be doing the heavy lifting of presenting the predictions and priorities. But before we get into our new crop of same, in the interest of transparency, maybe a little bit of fun, let's review last year's predictions, those we made this time.
Do we have to do that, Bob?
Oh, sure, why not? Here they are. I'll just go over them real quick, and then Tom and Bill can tell us how we did. Number one says the post-algorithmic era arrives. The idea is that algorithms are becoming commoditized. There are automated ways to try a whole library of candidates, and so emphasis moves from development of algorithms to their selection and good usage. Number two is that AI becomes widespread as disillusionment rises. The idea here is more, but not necessarily merrier. Increasing use of AI, but not always in the most skilled and experienced hands. So that means there may be a fair number of failures and associated disillusionment. Number three said we predicted open source proprietary analytical software and the cloud. All that stuff are fully intertwined. What we saw happening was that pretty much everyone seems to be using hybrid platforms for analytics, driven by capabilities in the cloud, and also the fact that established vendors are becoming more open and compatible. Number four was everyone claims to be a data scientist. This phenomenon is entirely Tom's fault. But what does the title really mean? Especially now we've got AI and machine learning in the mix. We concluded that analytics organizations have got to be very specific about what skills and experience they really need. You can't trust the titles. Number five is blockchain becomes a nemesis of analytics. The idea was blockchain is gaining popularity, but its data may be hard to get at and as structured, hard to analyze. And then finally, analytics are widely applied to improve data. I think we're certainly seeing this. More advanced analytics, including machine learning, in improving and automating the processes of data cleaning and preparation. So that was last year's crop. Tom, you want to go first? How did we do?
Who had these nutty ideas anyway?
Yeah.
I think we did pretty well, frankly. I strong believer in number one. I think that's happening more and more. We'll have a little bit more to say about that later. Number two, I don't know how much disillusionment there is yet, but certainly AI is becoming widespread. I'm in New York, went to the AI summit yesterday, literally several thousand people there, tons of vendors. Didn't feel like people were disillusioned. I think there may be some sense that it's harder than it was cracked up to be, and it's more evolutionary in its benefits than revolutionary, but I still see a huge amount of buy-in. Number three, very much so, that Amazon's user conference last week, I think it was, has had more and more of that sort of thing. Number four is certainly still true. Number five, I thought this was one of the more interesting things ever said about blockchain and analytics. It was Bill's idea, as I recall. But I have seen some cases where people are starting to use blockchain to aid analytics. In other words, using it, for example, to have distributed contracts for data use and access. So, specifying the conditions under which you could get access to data with a blockchain model. That's not really for analysis, which I think was Bill's point, but it does facilitate the process. And certainly I see more and more number six every day with probabilistic data integration and identifying data that appears to be a quality problem. So I think we did pretty well. I'm not really ashamed of any of these.
Bill, anything to add there?
No, I tend to agree with Tom that this year's batch, there were some past years where a couple of them really didn't happen as much as we had anticipated. I think all of these trends are definitely were heightened in 2018. I think if I were to pick the one that I think there's the most room to continue, the number six, it's definitely still trending towards people using analytics to support their data quality and cleaning processes more. I think I don't know that I'd say it's a complete rule yet. So anyone who's not doing that, I encourage them to look at that. And then I think the blockchain one, as Tom mentioned, using blockchain to support some of the contracts between data is an interesting way to line up the blockchain as a facilitator. I think as he said, the premise of this one was if you actually try and analyze a blockchain repository directly, it could be problematic. I haven't heard of as many companies attempting to crack that nut yet. So I guess we'll see as we go forward.
Yeah, if there were any problems with that prediction, it's that just that blockchain itself hasn't taken off quite as quickly as we might have predicted, but it's still right about analytics, I think.
So do I get to call it the weak link in our predictions chain?
Well,
sorry, apologies to all. So I think we did pretty well last year, and I hope that bodes well for what we're going to share right now. So for our first prediction, I go to Bill.
Yeah, so our first prediction, it's one that I think we all felt very strongly has become a major topic of discussion in the past year, certainly far more a topic of discussion than I have seen in times past. And I believe AI has helped focus the need for ethics, I believe, just because it's being applied to so many areas where ethics is an issue. But frankly, this has been bubbling underneath the world of analytics for a while. And so I've seen a couple of the major conferences focused on analytics, having not just speakers, but even tracks focused on ethics. I've seen a lot of our clients asking us about ethics. And I think, I know at IIA, we've got some plans to do some more research and blogging on this topic as well. So I think this is definitely a year where most organizations are at least going to start talking about it versus some have successfully dodged that conversation in the past.
Yeah, I noticed Gene Pease had I believe had a quote, he had a comment about the need for more privacy and so on. So I think we put that into this category. You could argue that we should have predicted it more for 2018, but I think it snuck up on a lot of people, including us. And I attribute about 90% of it, frankly, to Facebook and the whole, Russian fake news, et cetera, thing. Not that there aren't a lot of other issues, but that's what really has drawn the attention to the problem and the opportunity to fix it. And, I think in many cases, the issue is just relying too heavily on analytics on AI. And now you see a number of online companies like Facebook and Google and so on saying, yeah, we think people are maybe better at this than algorithms right now in terms of identifying fake news or identifying photos or whatever videos that ought not to be shown to other people. And so they retreated a little bit from analytics.
Very good. And the associated priority?
Yeah, so we think that definitely everybody needs to formally start thinking of ethics now, this year. It's definitely the time to do it, and really the analytics organization is going to have to take ownership of this themselves. So we recommend that analytics leadership make this a priority. One of two of the primary suggestions we have in terms of specifics would be actually setting up an ethics review board. In the world of research at universities and government research, particularly in the healthcare space, anything that touches people or animals actually has to go through an independent review board that just looks at the plan, study, and the logic behind it and what's going to be happening to the people or the animals, and then they validate, yep, this does appear to be ethical, and we think it would be a terrific idea to start to do that. But when you're doing analytics, when those analytics in any way touch sensitive data or will be used for sensitive purposes, and that helps make sure you're sanity checked. And then our other thought as well is, alongside that, starting to develop some written guidelines for the organization. What is fair and what is not fair? You've got a bunch of customer data or a bunch of health data, whatever it is. What are the general guidelines for what the organization should and shouldn't be doing with that data? And how analytics should and shouldn't be used once they're created. And by having some of that out there, it'll help keep things in line moving forward. But of course, it'll require ongoing diligence, but having some of these things in place provides a framework from which to enforce.
Good. Tom, anything to add there?
No, I agree with all of those things. Clearly, this photo suggests that if you do this, you will have high fives all around. Everybody will be very happy. But I don't see too many companies actually doing it yet. Microsoft has a chief ethicist of AI-related issues, but I do think it's an important issue and not a new one with AI. Algorithmic bias was certainly possible a long time ago. So it is to move on it.
A couple of questions came in via chat. Do we see prospects anytime soon for federal regulations around this, or a code of ethics for the analytics profession? Or is it too early times?
Unless you're sending that question in from Europe, no, clearly you haven't been paying much attention to what's going on in Washington right now. We hardly have a government at all, so it seems highly unlikely. And I recall some of the senators who were questioning Mark Zuckerberg, and they said they don't charge for their service, and the senators, well, at least one of them said, well, how can you make any money that way? So clearly the level of understanding is not high among our elected officials, and I would worry if we did have any, frankly. I think we'd be better off if we had them, but not with the current government.
Yeah, and I think the key is that's why we're recommending that the organizations take ownership of it themselves, because if you wait until the rules are official, you could well have gotten yourself in trouble on a few fronts already, because you have to do it. Now, I will say there are some areas where there are some regulations. In the financial industry, for example, there's some rules around what can go into credit scoring models and so forth. In the healthcare space, there's HIPAA that controls some of that data, but those are definitely the exceptions. There's not a broad set. And frankly, I would prefer to have analytics people who understand how this all works, developing those guidelines, than politicians. So to the extent we ever do get actual official rules, I think when we have analytics community leaders who are able to come forth and tell whatever committee is developing those rules, hey, here's what we found works well in the market today. Hopefully we can guide that.
Very good.
As Derek Larson points out, we do have some state level regulations emerging, particularly in California. So, but clearly it's going to be nutty if every state has its own regulatory structure. So we don't want to see that, I don't think, in the long run.
All right, very good. I think we should move on to number 2. Tom, you've got the lead on this one.
Okay, so this one has been around for a while. I've been advocating it for quite a while, but nobody seemed to pay any attention. Now, I think there is more interest in data as a differentiator rather than just analytics. And you know, the sad fact is that if you're using the same data as everybody else in your industry, then you're probably going to have the same analytics and you're not going to be getting any competitive advantage out of it. So increasingly important, I think, to think about what proprietary data do you have that could give you some distinctiveness in the marketplace. Obviously, we want some good analytics as well, maybe some distinctive analytics, but I think in many cases, the value is going to come from distinctive data. And you have a number of organizations now that are trying to think about, well, how do we monetize all the data that we've been collecting? General Motors has data on 9 million connected vehicles, and Charles Thomas, their chief analytics officer, is charged with figuring out how to make money off of it. That's not going to be easy, but I do think it's important. And you have a number of other cases where companies have started to do it. Since I'm in New York, I always think of, you know, I live in Boston. Generally, we hate New York mostly because of the sports rivalries. And I think of the great story of Joe Torre, who, as Yankee managers go, was one of the more gentlemanly ones, who told a story about the Red Sox going to NCAA headquarters and looking through handwritten records to try to identify what are the attributes that distinguish really high-performing, you know, baseball recruits at the college level, and then doing some analysis on it. So that, I think, is a great example of proprietary data. And you see it a fair amount in sports with the Houston Rockets were the first to do real analysis of video, and it has worked out well generally when teams or organizations have tried it.
Bill?
Yeah, I think the key on this one, as Tom said, this has been a trend that's certainly been there, but what really hit home to me that this was a major thing today was at our spring symposium and related analytics leadership consortium events. We had several different VCs give their view of the marketplace and where they're investing. And it was when all of them in their own way basically said, you know, we're not as excited about a company who just has some unique analytics approach, because we think that can be more easily replicated as opposed to a company that has a really unique set of data that has value that took a while to create. And so it comes down to, we've given lip service to the idea that data inherently has value in the past. But this was, you know, actually putting a valuation on that, saying we're going to invest, and we're going to invest at a, you know, at a higher multiple for a unique data set potentially than just a pure, you know, unique algorithm on top of classic data. And so, you know, hearing that formalized made me, you know, really gave me pause to say, wow, you know, we've arrived at a time where this data can literally be valued, not just on a transactional basis. You know, I'll pay you 5 cents to deliver this message on a Facebook or an email, but as a value in and of itself, worthy of purchase and acquisition money.
Very good. And the associated priority?
Well, there are a variety of them. I think certainly knowing what you have already is quite critical. It's, you know, a key part of being able to focus on data. So do a little inventory of things that might be proprietary and potentially valuable. Maybe you have it already as some exhaust from some business process that you're not really using effectively. Maybe you'll have to gather it like the Red Sox did. You know, that tends to be somewhat difficult activity, but might be useful. Maybe you can partner with another company to who doesn't want to use their data and give you proprietary access. And of course, you can buy it, but then it's not really proprietary, because if you can buy it, probably somebody else will. So syndicated data, which is the name for that sort of thing, tends to be not, I think, a source of a distinctiveness or competitive advantage. Or unless you somehow transform the data or turn it into something, some sort of analytical data product that other companies couldn't do for some reason. So there are a variety of ways. Charles Thomas told me that when they decided they were going to pursue this big data monetization at GM, they called in a bunch of consultants and said, help us figure out what to do about monetization. And many of them had recommended monetization, but then when he tried to pin them down on what they could actually do, they were sort of stuck for an answer. So it's easier to recommend it than to actually do it, but these are some of the basic steps you might consider.
So actually, the idea of partnering with close business partners to generate or combine and get unique data partially answers one of the chat questions that came in. The other one that came in is interesting. Who should own data monetization? Should it be product and services people? And to what extent does the CAO or CDO need to be able to help drive this?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I've talked about it some with some chief data officers, including Charles Thomas at GM, and many of them say that it's virtually impossible to do the traditional internal work with data and analytics and be responsible for external. There are different audiences, different processes, and so on. So what Charles Thomas has decided is he's only going to focus on the monetization issue, and he's gotten sign off from that from the rest of the organization, and he's kind of letting the rest of analytics be guided by other people or take their own course while he focuses on that. But I think it would be hard to do both if data monetization is a key aspect of your strategy.
All right, well questioned and well answered. Bill, what would you like to add on this priority?
I think the like Tom said, certainly there'd be a question of how much can an individual handle, but I agree there would probably be somebody who is tasked with focusing on the monetization. Whether they're reporting to the CAO, whether the CAO does a large part of his or her time on that, and then has hired someone under them to take care of some of the other stuff. I don't think that's important, but you're not going to get there without that focus. And I think the easy first step here is to look around at what type of data that you're capturing, and as was mentioned earlier, and maybe you in combination with one of your partners, that data combined would have huge value for not just yourselves, but possibly the industry. Just do an inventory. Not everybody will have something that they could monetize right now necessarily, but many will, and if you're looking out for it, when the opportunity arises, you'll hopefully be able to go for it.
Very good. So let's move on to number 3. Back to Bill.
Yeah, this is one I think is not so unexpected. The hackers and the fraudsters out there have always been fairly aggressive, and a lot of the innovation in the internet technologies and how things work, even transaction processing, et cetera, has been driven in part by having to thwart the ever-increasing sophistication level of the fraudsters and hackers. AI now, of course, is simply elevating that, and so we now have not just world-class hackers that are sitting there coding away to try and hack systems, but they're beginning to apply these very technologies that we're all excited about against us. So starting to leverage AI in order to perpetuate the attacks in the first place, and so that's leading to where, of course, to fend off the AI created attacks that might be somewhat unique, you may have to now be starting to have AI running to learn how to better block, and it's going to be that ongoing circular arms race where as soon as we patch the one hole, they'll keep finding it. But AI is just starting to get utilized now to look for yet new ways, and so the arms race continues.
I studied this a little bit for my new book, which is a little bit of a plug there. I noticed Lindsay is giving copies away. Thank you, Lindsay. But you can buy one too. I think that's allowed. But in this book, I talk about the fact that there is a huge amount of potential for AI. And in fact, I don't think that it will ultimately be possible to do cybersecurity and fraud prevention effectively without AI, because there's just too much going on for humans to address it all. But I think we're kind of in that awkward stage now where we know we're going to need AI, but the AI isn't quite good enough yet to make life a whole lot easier for us. You know, the threat signatures are too hard to analyze, or there's not enough data to really, you know, identify a pattern. So we end up with, I think, a lot of false positives as we try to use AI for this right now. But certainly, I don't know if it'll happen in 2019 or sometime later, but I think it's inevitable that we have to use this technology for cybersecurity and fraud prevention purposes. And you know, I think there will be more data. The good news, I guess, about all the hackers out there is there's going to be a lot more data about breaches and hacks and fraud attempts. So we can start to use analytics and AI to analyze it.
It strikes me that this is kind of another dimension of problem here, because been using AI and machine learning for a long time to, or for some years, to analyze network traffic and isolate what might appear to be an attempted breach. But this is having to combat the use of AI to do better impersonations of people, customers, their data, and so on. It's like fraud on the phone, but automated.
Yeah,
so
and, you know, you've heard some of those.
Is to fight that off.
You've heard some of those efforts by Google, for example. I think it's now called Google Duplex, to make a phone reservation somewhere. I think we could see similar kinds of calls used for, you know, empty my bank account, please, and send the check to this address, or, you know, there'd be all sorts of opportunities for fraud there.
Bill, more to add, or should we go to the priority?
Yeah, let's hit the priority, I think. Yeah, so I think the key here is you're going to have to watch out for this. One question, by the way, I saw that came in on the panel was just clarifying what we're calling AI. So AI would encompass in these terms here, especially in this specific case, basically machine learning algorithms, deep learning, language processing, right? The various, there's a variety of methods out there that are being utilized in this space. But the priority here is to keep an eye out. If you have security companies, for example, you're working with, they're likely using AI, but you should make sure that they are starting to use AI to incorporate it. And keep in mind that the value of some of our traditional security measures is moving to zero. So, you know, there are now algorithms out there that can fake your voice, can fake a video of you, that are starting to become very, very, very convincing. So to Tom's point, you know, it's not going to be very long before someone with a recording this webinar will be able to fake my voice and call one of my, you know, a bank or a brokerage or something, and actually convincingly have my voice actually asking to have my account drained and moved to some offshore fund. And so, you know, all of this is going to lead to new, you know, new security procedures and then AI to identify it. So I've read about how the fake video, AI can identify a fake video in some cases better than a person, because the AI algorithms are able to look at some of the pixel patterns that wouldn't be visible to our eye, but where maybe it's either a little too smooth of a transition or not quite smooth enough on different parts of the video because it was faked. But yeah, definitely some work to do in this area.
Or even worse, Bill, they might fake your voice and do a competing predictions and priorities webcasts.
Well, and then next year we'll just admit that the fake one was the one that was most wrong, and that the real one was the one that was right.
There you go. We're already adapting here. Yeah.
Tom, anything to add here?
No, I don't think so. It makes sense. Work with your vendors, because almost everybody uses vendors on this issue. You know, try it out. As I say, you're probably going to have some false positives, and in most cases, we're still going to have to use humans to investigate. I think be prepared for somewhat labor-intensive process in the short run.
Very good. On chat, we had this whole point underscored very concisely. Hackers use AI too in order to try to commit the fraud. So it's best that we keep up and combat it.
Yeah, that's why we called it an arms race. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go to number 4, Tom.
So this is kind of an organizational prediction, and it's that analytics and AI groups should merge into a single organization within companies. I think there's a lot of that that's already happened. In some cases, it's not the case. People think, oh, you know, AI, that's a different set of skills. It's sexier, but let's face it, AI is analytics, at least for the bulk of it. If you're talking about machine learning, it is statistical in nature, and some of it is even, you know, using things like regression analysis. If you have ever done regression analysis on some data and then use that resulting model to score some other data, you have done machine learning. So you can say you've already done it within your analytics group. And I just think in general that there are a whole variety of reasons for combining it. I think Bill wrote in our report, there's no other group within the organization that's going to have as much in common with AI as the analytics people. The analytics group, if it's a good one, already has strong business relationships, and that's a critical asset that could really, the AI technology would benefit from. And let's face it, AI is the kind of glitzy new bauble, shiny new bauble these days, and you don't want to pass up on some of that visibility if you run an analytics group. So far better, I think, to combine them and you know, get some benefit from the shininess, but say, oh, we have a whole variety of techniques, some of which are more traditional analytics, some of which are AI oriented, and we're seeing more and more of that already, but not enough. We probably ought to see it in every organization, as far as I'm concerned.
Bill?
Yeah, and I think like Tom said, a lot of organizations are putting AI within the analytics team from the get-go, but not all are. And I agree with Tom. I think it makes sense for it. It's most closely aligned with the analytics organization. And then I think that not only provides that economy of scale, but as Tom said, it does allow that glow of AI to shine and benefit the analytics organization, as opposed to potentially detracting from it somehow, and you end up in some type of zero-sum game of, well, we're going to, you know, take this much money from analytics to fund AI over here. Far better to be saying we're going to, you know, fund this much money for the analytics organization to deploy against their priorities that now include AI.
Very good. We got some questions rolling in, but let's go to the priority and then grab a couple.
Sure. So I think if you run an analytics organization, your first priority should be to lay claim to this field, lay claim to AI, assuming that nobody else has already grabbed it. When you do that, you may want to rename your organization. Pfizer, for example, has an analytics and AI lab, and it's run by some of the same people who did analytics, but they've definitely I think they have over 150 AI projects now that this kind of center of excellence oversees. You perhaps will see a change in the name of IIA. Maybe it'll be IIAIA or something like that in the future. I'll leave that to Bill.
As long as they're all vowels, we're okay.
Yeah, exactly. I'll leave that to Bill and Jack Phillips to decide. But if an AI group already exists separate from an analytics group, you might start discussing a merger with the head of that other organization. Maybe you could start to work on projects together to get a little comfort. And if you're running a purely, traditional analytics group, you might want to start upskilling some of your people to be able to do some AI-oriented work. And, you know, it's not all statistical in nature. There is a kind of a semantic AI where you have to build knowledge graphs and understand the relationships between terminologies. I think for the language-oriented things, there's some statistical approaches, but not all of them. You might want to add some skills to that, of that nature to your analytics group as well. And my guess is the machine learning stuff, your best traditional analytics professionals will be able to move into relatively easily.
Bill?
Yeah, I'll just add the real quick thought. I agree with much of what Tom said, is that, you know, if you're an analytics leader, be proactive and try and take ownership of this and drive this discussion. It'll be I believe it'll be in the best interest of those individuals and their teams, but also for the company to try and keep these efforts coordinated. So that would be just what I'd add on top of Tom.
It occurs to me that organizationally, this is a pattern we've seen many times. A new technology comes along, some of the technologies around big data, for example, and when organizations are first using them, they've got specialized teams or groups, and those get folded into typically the central analytics organization, and then ultimately get moved out, embedded into the business as the skills and capabilities become more commonplace.
We'll have more to say about that in a little while.
Yes, we will. All right, should we go to number 5?
Yeah, so the other one, this has again been an issue that's been out there, but we're thinking this year is going to be when the lack, you know, we say model deployment rates become a big issue. It's not that the issue is there's so much deployment going on that people can't handle it. It's that we still have a scenario where far too few analytics efforts are truly getting deployed in an organization to drive that value. So I know the Rexer data science survey that comes out each year, it's said somewhere between 10 and 15% of companies almost always deploy results. Another 50% deployed, quote, often, and I think we all know that often probably always translates to a little less than what you would hope often would mean, and 35 to 40 were occasionally or rarely. So that obviously can't continue as across the board we're seeing increased investment in analytics organizations, analytics technology, the data that supports it. All of that is an output of money. You've got to start to get that return, and without deploying, you simply aren't going to do it. And so we think that some of these big investments that have been made, some companies making big bets on analytics organizations, they're going to really going to want to start to see more deployment and ergo more value. So a lot of these barriers we've had historically, both from a technology and a process perspective to deployment, it's, you know, they need to start getting, they're going to need to start getting worked through, because it just cannot continue where so few of our models are getting deployed. Tom?
Yeah, I was really interested in this trend because I don't know, I'm sure it's been going on for a while, but I heard, I think 4 or 5 estimates from organization over the past year of what their model deployment rates were. One said 100%, which was quite impressive. One said 0%, which was not so good. Another said 6%, another said 15%. So this started to alert me, yeah, there's a real problem here. And how can we be doing something that is supposed to provide economic value, yet not providing any value at all if the models don't get used or deployed? And so I think it's really critical to start thinking along these lines, and you know, to measure it. Maybe that's getting into priority, and also to think about what are the issues there in whether things do get deployed or not. You know, I think in analytics, people tend to like the model building process. They like to kind of solve the analytical problem, not necessarily quite as focused on solving the business problem. And that's where we run into trouble with these. So
one of the first questions to pop was, what's the optimal deployment rate? Presumably, we need some room to allow experiments that may not pan out. We don't want to work on safe and program stuff.
Yeah, 78.3%, don't you think, Bill?
Perfect. More than 42.
I might lean more towards 78.25, but no, but in all seriousness, I think the answer I would give there, I think it does depend. It ought to be that a very high percentage of your successful models and efforts should be deployed. Now, to the extent that you've done some experiments, which you always have to do, and they don't pan out, I think obviously you don't want to deploy those. And just to tie to a couple of the comments that also came in, clearly when you do deploy, you've got to put up some governance and quality control measures around that. And then there is the flip side of deploy. So to me, deployment doesn't stop at the analytics and IT organizations successfully embedding those analytics, but then there's the end user or end system utilization of those analytics. So are the people out in the call center going to then actually access and make use of, maybe it's some propensity scores, for example, that we have deployed? That's where the value comes from. So, this deployment does have a number of issues under it that have to be all addressed together, but clearly the answer just can't continue to be that it's just hard to do, so we typically just don't do it.
But the ultimate measure is a business measure, not a completion measure. Very good. And the priority?
Yeah, I believe this one is, we've actually covered a lot of this, I believe, in our conversation. It's just, you've got to make this a priority. And the reality is, we all know, and I speak from personal experience, having been subject to compensation plans and helping define compensation plans, make it part of people's comp plan, make it part of their annual objectives. If you're not doing that, in reality, it will never get the focus. And I think also to maybe formally charter some type of task force. Again, sometimes those can end up being just a big waste of overly bureaucratic process. But if you do it right, just to examine what have been the barriers we've hit from a technical perspective, from a political perspective, when we've tried and failed to deploy in the past. And if you can at least get an understanding of what those barriers are, you can then start to look at how you can bypass them. But this is definitely not a small ask or a small thing to do to get to where you're really deploying effectively and efficiently. But again, it's really necessary, and with the amount of operationalizing and deployment of analytics that is beginning to occur, it's beyond just a few leaders that are successfully doing it now. So you're going to start falling behind pretty soon now if you're still in that chunk that doesn't do any of this. Tom?
Well, it's interesting. I think part of this is a mindset change and thinking about analytics in a very different way. In the report that's coming out on these predictions and priorities, I noticed Bill, who drafted most of it, was saying he was constantly referring to an analytics process rather than an analytical model or something. And first I thought, that's kind of annoying. Why does he do that all the time? But then I don't know if you did it on purpose, Bill, but I think if you think about analytics as a process with a set of stages and a set of activities, and the end result isn't the model, the end result is a successful business result. That's a very different way of thinking.
So you're saying you've come around that I wasn't crazy after all?
Yes, I edited a few of your process mentions out, but I mostly left them all in.
And in the chat, it's been suggested correctly, I think, that success begins with framing the problem and having the right focus, knowing you've got the data.
Yeah, that's the early stage, exactly.
Process. All righty. And let's move on to number 6.
Well, this one was anticipated by, I think, Tim in our chat stream there. Maybe we should just crowdsource these things. But
you're doing a good job of it here.
This is the idea of the citizens taking over, not just citizen data analysts and so on. We've been talking about those for a while, but increasingly citizen data scientists, business users who can do pretty sophisticated data science work. And this is I think, mostly enabled by new technologies. We've had on the business analysis, data analysis side, or business intelligence, you might call it, we've had, graphical tools for quite a while. Companies buy 30,000 licenses of some of these tools so everybody can use them. And I think that's a good thing. But then there are also some new tools that have search-based interfaces that make it just as easy to find out and do an analysis as doing a Google search, or see if there have been other similar searches already the same way that Google does. And then on the data science side, you have these automated machine learning tools that can do a massive amount of the work, traditionally technical and analytical work in machine learning without a whole lot of intervention by a human. And for the most part, I think it goes really well. A lot of data scientists are concerned about this, but once they see it, they tend to say, wow, this could really change the deployment of data science within our organization, machine learning, et cetera. So driven by technology, of course, it's going to mean some cultural changes. And I think ultimately it will mean that business understanding and the ability to communicate effectively around analytics and to think about the organizational change issues will become more important than some of the technical skills that we relied on heavily, technical and analytical skills. And we kind of presaged this a little bit in our in our prediction from last year about the post-algorithmic age. I think this is just kind of an extension of that one.
Good, Bill?
Yeah, and I think the key here, I'm one of those analytical folks who a decade ago was highly resistant to the idea of anybody outside of the trained professionals using analytical models and so forth. And I have slowly come around. For example, in reality today, things like, let's just take a classic mainstay, a logistic regression or decision tree being utilized to identify who's most likely to respond to a given offer, a given campaign, et cetera. The reality is it's fully understood how to apply those models in that context. And is it really important for somebody to understand how the math works below it? I don't know that that's necessarily true, as long as they know when and why they'll be using a logistic regression, and they know how to interpret the percentages that come out, and they know how to apply that. So, as long as you put some guardrails in line, I think we can enable people to do more than they have today, and that'll free up time then for the hardcore analytical folks to go develop the new stuff and the more complicated stuff that can't yet be made easier with today's tools.
Very good. And the associated priority, Tom?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to make sure that you have the tools in place that make this possible. That's, I guess, part of what we describe here as enabling these users. I generally agree with Bill that guardrails are a good idea, but the technology itself, in many cases, has the guardrails, and it'll, the best, I think, automated tools for this will say, by the way, you have a binary dependent variable, so you can do a logistic regression here. They wouldn't even need to know that much. I do think that it's a good idea, regardless of what tools you have, to observe the process and check the outcome some, and engage both with your citizens and with your data scientists and professionals, and get them working in a collaborative fashion. Probably some education is a good idea to, if nothing else, tell people that this possibility exists, and try to create more analytical and data science oriented citizens, because most of us would agree that's good for the organization, and just some support if people run into trouble.
Is this a case where it might make sense to have, at least temporarily, I don't know if you'd call it a center of excellence or support, but a cadre in the central analytics organization that whose job is to do this enablement. And by working with citizen data scientists across the enterprise, always have your finger on the pulse of what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, grabbing best practices and sharing them.
Yes, I think that makes an awful lot of sense. Maybe we should revise our much reviewed analytics organization paper, Bob, and include something like that.
Very good. Bill?
Yeah, the one thing I'll throw out, just to give some folks a tangible example of, I'll mention some guardrails. In a past life, I was providing the specifications for a software product that it had been determined was going to embed some predictive modeling capabilities for marketing users within a CRM context. And so there was a lot of debate. What do we let them do? What don't we let them do? And so what we ended up agreeing to was there were certain things that those users would typically want to be using on an ongoing basis. Who's going to buy within the next 30 days, for example? Let's predict that. So we predefined certain things that could be predicted, like response within 30 days, response within 90 days. And then we also had some predefined metrics, a whole bunch of them, of customer level metrics that we thought would be relevant for predicting things like that. And so it was going to enable then those less sophisticated users to pick one of some pre-approved things to predict that we knew were appropriate to predict with a bunch of pre-approved variables to try it. And then we use some of the automated modeling approaches to validate that a model was at least fairly decent, or we wouldn't serve it back. But it was a way to really open up that world to a user base who would not have been able to do it all on their own, but still allow us to have some confidence that they weren't going to go and do something really inappropriate, because we had those tight constraints around what they were able to do.
Very good. Tom, any more on this?
No, I don't think so. I think we should put these to bed and maybe talk about some general questions.
Okay, great.
If there are any.
Actually, I'll invite you guys if you want to do a quick scan. We've had a lot of general questions kind of beyond our scope here. If any of them have popped for you, you're particularly interested. We could see, Lindsay, we've got a slide with all 6. Perfect.
Yeah, Eric King, I think, has a question about, I like this line, that he refers to pilot purgatory, and do we see organizations moving from these kind of disparate ad hoc projects that rarely get picked up or deployed, and have a more centralized, at least federated analytics program that prioritizes projects, that looks at whether they're deployed or not, that manages the whole process? And I think that raises an interesting point. It's related to a couple of issues that we did, the deployment one and some of the other changes in analytics organizations. I think it probably now, I think we're seeing more and more previously centralized organizations starting to decentralize. And in a way that's good, because it means that there's a demand for their services, and the business leaders want these people on their staffs and so on. But it does mean that you may not have as much sort of oversight of the process that gets used in doing analytics. So we may need to find some hybrid that allows some process standards in analytical and AI work, and at the same time gives people the ability to, have analytics experts and citizen and non-citizen data science types on their staffs, so that they can use them for a whole variety of things.
Very good. Bill, do you want to add to that or not?
No, what I was going to do, I was going to throw out, I noticed one that came in earlier back when we had been on our first, one of our first topics, and it was about how internal review boards at an institutional level, actually, that for transparency purposes, they're often required to make the application public. In other words, I could go and say, hey, university, I'd like to see what these people did. And so the question was, would companies actually abide by such a structure? And I think the key would be, today we have nothing in place at companies. So I don't know that we'd have to go as far as saying that publicly these things need to be available in the true public sense versus internally there's a transparency of there was this application and the appropriate people internally can go check it out and look at those details. And there was a group of people who were not simply the analytical people and their business sponsor that made the determination that this was fair game. So I think I was thinking in that case more of the concept of a review board conceptually than an exact replication of the potentially more rigorous than might make sense that actually happens in academia.
I had a related question back to our first prediction, which is, a fully qualified business analytics ethicist is going to be hard to come by. So what functions, what experiences would you try to recruit onto your 3 or 4 ethics board?
Well, it's been hard times lately for philosophy PhDs, so maybe this could
one of
be
those stir things up.
The Full Employment Act for them. Yeah.
There could be a job out there for people to be an ethics consultant that sit around and go on these boards as an external representation on some of these corporate boards. If you could establish yourself a nice track record of being able to show some competency in working through ethical issues, it's interesting potential job creation opportunity for someone out there.
Very good. We have one more you want to jump on? We're almost at the top of the hour.
Well, just a quick one. Somebody pointed out, we don't have a whole lot of clarity about what is AI and what isn't AI. And in many cases, it is just analytics. I think it was Michael Gizzi's point. And so all the more reason, I think, to kind of combine these things together as we were suggesting.
Very good. Well, thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
And thanks to everybody who contributed not just questions, but to the extensive chat here. I hope everybody got value out of that, as well as everything that Tom and Bill had to say. Lindsay?
Yeah, thanks, Bob, and thank you, Tom and Bill, and thank you everyone who joined today. And the questions are fantastic, to Bob's point. Thank you so much. Have a great day, folks.